All right. Hello again, everybody, and welcome to those of you that have been trickling in. Um, we are offering today's webinar called Tips, Tricks, and Advice for Publishing in Various Formats and Sources, Part 2. And I will be putting a link in the chat in a little bit to the Part 1 session that we had in October. It was recorded, and that way, if anyone wants to go back and review some of the things that we discussed in Part 1, you're welcome to review that information there. Because for today's Part 2, we will be kind of starting from where we finished during the Part 1 and then asking questions that we didn't tackle during that first session. So hopefully, yeah, if you need to go back and look at Part 1, that's available for you there. But we've got a whole new set of questions today. But before we do begin, we will do the land acknowledgement. So while we meet here on a virtual platform, we should take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are each located. We acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples. And we do invite you to learn more about the territory on which you reside, and you can look at the website native/land.ca to find out more information. And I'm coming to you today from the city of Toronto, which acknowledges that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The city also acknowledges that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. The City of Toronto has been acknowledging the traditional territory since March 2014, and due to conversations with Indigenous leaders, including the Aboriginal Advisory Committee as part of the 2018 Toronto for All campaign, the language the City of Toronto uses has evolved. My name is Nicole McNair. I am a fourth-year PhD student at McMaster University, and this year I am the chair of the Student Concerns Subcommittee. And our Student Concerns Subcommittee has listened to your responses from our student survey this year, and so many of you have been asking for webinars about publication, and that's why we've decided to offer not just one part, but two parts to really get into a lot of the concerns that students have about publication and the process. And so we're here to tackle all of that information today. One last thing before we get started, just some housekeeping concerns. If you would like to access live transcripts, if you look at the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, you can find that information there. You can also ask questions in the chat. However, we do ask that you save your questions, and we will be addressing those in the second part of the conversation. And please note that your name and question will be visible to all attendees. If you do see a question in the chat that someone else has asked, and it's a question that you really would like asked, please upvote for that question, and that will bring it to the top of the list. So we'll know to ask that question because there's a lot of interest in that one. And now to welcome our panelists for today. We're so excited to have these three wonderful panelists with us. So first we have Dr. Sharla Alegria from the University of Toronto. And Sharla is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Toronto. Her research examines how intersecting inequalities of race and gender persist in workplaces and shape the goods and technologies those workplaces produce. She is published in journals including American Journal of Sociology, Social Problems, and Gender and Society. Dr. Alegria serves as deputy editor for Gender and Society and has held editorial board roles with American Sociological Review and Socius, alongside extensive experience as a peer reviewer across sociology and related fields. So welcome, Sharla. Next, we have Dr. Dale Spencer, who is a professor in the Department of Law and Legal Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Formerly a Banting Fellow, Ontario Early Research Award recipient, and Faculty of Public Affairs Research Excellence Chair, his main research interests are violence, sport, victimization, policing, youth, sex crimes, and conceptions of homelessness, domicile, and the law. Welcome. And finally, we have Dr. Sarita Shrivastava from OCAD University. Dr. Shrivastava is Professor of Sociology and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science at OCAD University in Toronto. Her research includes social movements, race, and emotion in Queen's University's Department of Sociology, Gender Studies, and Cultural Studies. She researched and taught on race, gender, and nation. Shrivastava's book, Are You Calling Me a Racist?, received the 2025 Canadian Sociology Book Award. Her work reveals why conventional diversity policies and anti-racism workshops have failed to effectively dismantle racism and offers concrete alternatives. So welcome to the three of you. We are so grateful to have you all here with us today and look forward to the wonderful conversation we're going to have and to use your experience to help us all out. Before we get started with publishing questions, though, I will give each of you some time to introduce yourselves and maybe add a little bit more information from the bios that I read, or feel free to talk a little bit more about your research or experiences with publication. And maybe we'll do this in reverse alphabetical order, if that's okay, and start with you, Sarita.
Hi, thank you so much. It's lovely to be here, and I'm really interested also in hearing what's happening with the graduate students today and what they're confronting and interested in and dealing with in terms of publishing challenges, because things have changed in the 20 years since I started publishing. What I can say is that one of my interests in publishing is not just in my own research, because of course that's something that I've been active in terms of publishing in journals and a book, but I'm always thinking about supporting the publication careers of my students and also their careers in general. So how to prepare them for applying for jobs, and also to think about how to continue the trajectory of what initially interested them in their research, because they often come with the desire to change their world or to make a difference. And so I always encourage them to think about ways of not just publishing formally in scholarly venues, but also to think about non-academic and public scholarship. And that's something that I've also been committed to. So I'm happy to talk about that as well as something that is not instead of, but can be alongside of, and that actually can extend your impact as a scholar. So thanks.
And that will be so helpful. Also, I know I'm definitely interested in that type of publication as well. Thank you. Next, Dr. Dale Spencer.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm Dr. Dale Spencer. I'm in the Department of Law and Legal Studies, but I received my PhD in sociology, so I've become a rebel and left the sociological field. No, that's not true. Yeah, I was reviewing actually my CV last night, and I think one of the things that I've tried to do throughout my career, and I got my first sort of academic position in 2012, and has been publishing with students, and so I've published over 30 papers with journal articles with students. And I think that like one of the things that is really important is to understand that there's an entire sort of game that's associated with publishing that is requires multiple skeleton keys. And I still remain somewhat surprised at some of the reactions I get to some of the papers I submit. So we'll try and go through some of those experiences today. In terms of ongoing things that I could add to this, I have three SHRC grants currently going on. One on the sex offender registry, another one on youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities in conflict with the law, and then another one on parents of youth with that are in conflict with the law. So I'm sort of doing a lot of work on youth these days from a sociological standpoint. And I have a forthcoming book called Enmeshed Realities, young people's in digital ecologies is the subtitle. But yeah, I would say that like having a general, both broad level of sort of areas of interest also gives me a different ways in which different reviewing cultures operate. Because sociology is one, criminology and other fields have a very different way of sort of approaching what is acceptable work.
And that's something really great to keep in mind because so much sociological work is intersectional. And so students do submit to so many different types of journals as well. So that's really, really helpful as well. Thank you. And Dr. Sharla Alegria.
Hi, thanks so much for the really generous introduction already. And I'm really happy to be here with you all and to be able to have this conversation. I think I would just mention one thing that I keep finding one kind of conversation I keep finding myself pulled into both. I'm like right now I have sort of editorial kind of, so I'm on the editorial board for Socius and I'm deputy editor for Gender and Society. And both journals now I have been in these conversations about AI and what that means for the publication process, both on the end of preparing manuscripts and in the review process. And I have so many questions and fears about this. So I don't know if we'll get to talk about that today, but it's one of the things that's been on my mind quite a lot recently. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And yeah, AI is definitely something that I know from students, there's a lot of conversations and a lot of people are thinking about these types of things as well. So feel free to add to any of the conversations during today's webinar, any insight that you've had with some of those conversations that you've been having as well. And I know our student body would really appreciate hearing everything. So without further ado, let's jump into the Q&A portion. And we're actually going to start off with a very similar question that was our last question in part one, just to sort of tie the two together. And I think it's just a really helpful question. But I'd like to know, what are some of the most common mistakes that you've seen, either as editorial board members from paper submissions that come in, or maybe from your own experiences, feedback that you've received about mistakes that you've made during the publication process? So yeah, just let's start by talking about mistakes. And maybe Dale, we'll start with you this time, if that's okay. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, failed a lot. So I'm gonna, should I put my video on? Because it keeps shutting off. There we go. I would suggest at some level that my experience of publishing is sort of started with learning about sort of failures in a sort of harsh way. So I had come out of my master's. I had worked with a professor on a paper, largely quantitative, and we had published a paper, but it was largely, I think I was third author, and it was really sort of, I was removed from all of the, we'll call them vagaries of the peer review process. And then as a PhD student, I was writing a paper in my first year, and I thought, and it still actually remains one of my most cited papers, but that I was going to change the conversation in this one area. And I really thought that this was going to be a hard-hitting paper. And I submitted it to what in the criminological sort of field is one of the top 3 journals. And I was convinced this was going to get accepted, and it was going to, all in all, I was going to, be blasted into the, universe of criminology, and everybody would recognize me and I would become a celebrity overnight. The grandiosity of that notwithstanding, I think the reality is that I got a review back, and this was back in the days of snail mail, which none of you will be able to resonate with, except for maybe some of our panelists. But so I got back the review in paper form, and it was a thick envelope that had my review in it. And this was sort of, it was an older journal, so they didn't sort of switch to email just yet. But I remember the great pains that the editor went to reject my paper. She wrote a 4-page response, and the reviewers' sort of response to the paper were about the same length, so that she sort of went, giving away the gender of the person, went to great lengths to reject the paper. And I took it very personally. And so this is where I would say the first sort of failure of is that we tend to not really see our own blind spots. And I think a lot of the times not recognize that sometimes the paper is just not a good fit, which is the first thing that I wanted to sort of bring about. The second thing is you might be engaging in a conversation that the editor doesn't want. the journal to go into. So you're having a conversation about something over here. The journal is going in a very different direction, and you seemingly are not really part of that sort of group. And so this is, I guess, the lesson of that point was that recognizing what are the conversations, what are the things that are being highlighted in that journal is a very important part of the process. I then took my paper to a sort of up and coming journal. My paper was in turn accepted. I had a very glowing reviews. And so I say that one of the things that you can gather from failure is to take that specific experience, take those reviews and recognize that people thought long and hard about your paper before they rejected it. And you can use those constructively to make your paper better and then in turn get it accepted somewhere else. And yeah, I'm going to limit it at that because I want to let Sharla and Sarita come in on this conversation.
Thank you so much. And I know just from colleagues and friends of mine that, yeah, taking things personally and rejection is a really very real part of publishing, but a really challenging thing to deal with as well. So thank you for addressing that. And maybe we'll turn to Sarita now and then Sharla afterward.
Thank you. My mistake was going to be exactly the same. I don't think of it as a mistake. I think it's a very common reaction. As you say, we all respond in that way. But that was similar to what Dale shared. I think we all have a similar story of the first comments. My first one wasn't a rejection, yeah, or let's say second paper at a major journal was accepted, but some of the reviewers had a very particular perspective on the paper that wasn't shared by the editor. And so I was quite infuriated. I remember I was like, I can't believe they call, and it was, for example, it was something like I had pointed out the relationship between racism, imperialism, and feminism or something. And one reviewer had said that's maybe applicable in Canada, but not the US or something like that. I was like, I can't, what? And so that sort of that reactive response means that you don't take the time to actually think, well, how do I strengthen my paper so that I'm actually persuading, which is my job, persuading the people who aren't already persuaded. I mean, that's the job of the paper. It's not to speak to people who already know what I'm saying, but it's actually to show how my current research and analysis actually brings us to a conclusion about this movement. And so that actually, of course, in the end, strengthen the paper, and it didn't take much to strengthen the paper. The editor said, we don't agree with, and there was some other similar kinds of comments, like maybe racism and feminism was an issue before, but that's kind of a dated critique. So things like that. So, where I, they were saying, we don't agree with these critiques, but we need you to address this. These are our reviewers. These are scholars in the field that are saying this. We'd like your paper. So after I got over that reaction, and it really helped me to then advise my PhD students in the future when they, again, have that response, like, I can't believe the reviewer said this. So there's the response that Dale has rightly pointed out, which is that there may be a different journal, but sometimes it's really just, as Dale also said, recognizing that the people who have reviewed your paper have actually often generously spent some time. They may not agree with you. You may be on different pages, but that's what academic life is about. We have different perspectives on the same question. People taking time to share that with you is actually a form of generosity and academic community. Because even when they're telling you why they don't agree, they're taking the time to do so. They're giving you maybe citations that are different, and you can use all of that to strengthen your paper. Maybe resubmit it or submit it there. But that's, I think, a very common mistake, which is that we withdraw from critique instead of using it, thinking about it carefully, and thinking about it as a form of generosity. And we see this even on PhD defenses. Like usually the people on the committee are there with the purpose of strengthening the students' work, and it can be really easy to take offense or be upset, at that kind of conversation. So I wouldn't call it a mistake, but it's certainly an opportunity, sometimes a missed opportunity, to actually think about how can that process of publishing that feels so brutal actually be a way, an entry point into strengthening your work down the line.
That's so wonderful. Thank you for bringing that other perspective. And I'm sure a lot of students will be taking that with them today. just that reframing and not taking things quite so personally.
Thank you.
All right. And Sharla, would you like to add to the failures and mistakes?
Thanks so much for this. First, I think I want to acknowledge my co-panelists here. I think it's just really helpful sort of guidance in terms of thinking about the publication and the peer review process. That like one of the things that I think I've been so encouraged by on the like as my deputy editor role is just seeing like how like just the spirit of like constructive, earnest generosity that goes into this process. Sometimes reviewers are mean. I will say they're sometimes they're just mean, but like in general, overwhelmingly, folks are like really just want to see cool work get better. But I actually was going to go in a totally different direction with this question, which is like the more practical, like the pragmatic like manuscript preparation part of this. And I have like kind of I think like 4 points, but maybe I went a little overboard making notes for myself earlier. So just kind of come with me on this for a sec. So I think that the biggest mistake that folks make that I keep seeing in manuscript preparation is submitting a manuscript before it's really ready. And I think that the things that I'm seeing that are like signs that I mean, and some of this is me too. Like I've definitely submitted manuscripts before they were ready. And some of the signs to me that suggest that maybe like you need another reader or a little bit more development, some opportunity to sharpen the focus is if you can't seem to get the word count down to what the journal is asking, and I don't mean like, a few hundred words. I mean, like, if you just don't know how you're going to get the manuscript down to 10,000 words, you probably haven't figured out what the paper is really about yet, or it might be about 2 or 3 different things. And that's an opportunity, I think, to ask, for another friendly reader and to kind of reevaluate what's going on there that you can't get it down to the word count. I think another sign is that if you can't state the paper's key contribution in like a sentence, you might not know what the paper's key contribution is yet. So if someone asks you what's the paper about and you just feel like this moment of fear and then begin to like ramble on for a paragraph or so, you're not ready. Like it's not ready. And the third thing that I feel like I keep seeing that I've seen in a few papers now is not addressing like all of the relevant literature. And I don't mean that you have to address every single paper, but like broadly speaking, all of the relevant literature should be in there. And this is actually super important because the people who are the reviewers who are going to read the paper are the people who wrote that relevant literature. And if they see the stuff that they worked really hard on, that they care deeply about, I don't mean you have to cite them personally, but they care about the literature usually more than they care about their own work. Like I very rarely see people tell like in reviews, I very, very rarely see reviewers tell authors to cite me, but they do say cite this literature. And then they'll pick up on like the kind of most cited, biggest, kind of impact papers in the area and be like, you really need to address this. And they're usually, I think, really helpful. So make sure that you're addressing those kind of key areas. And then the fourth thing, and I just want to use the word antagonize. Like there are all kinds of things that you may not realize are going to antagonize editors or reviewers. So some of this is like, maybe you just walked into a hornet's nest and you didn't realize it, right? But a lot of the time, like, if you just cited a couple of the key papers in an area, you might be able to avoid that. And I think the fourth thing is pretty minor, but making sure that you're following all of the formatting guidelines for the journal. I keep seeing papers that are submitted like single space, and that just feels mean. Like, I'm gonna read this like 30-page, dense document, single spaced. And they should obviously be double spaced so that they're easy to read, but it's a pretty minor thing to just follow the formatting guidelines.
That's so helpful as well. And thank you all for sharing just very different mistakes and things to think about as well, because again, we have so many students who have so many different questions. So it's really great to have lots of different answers. So we'll jump into a bit more about actual, like the process of publication now. And I know a lot of students often wonder the differences between open source publishing versus closed access journals, and whether there's advantages or disadvantages to one over the other. And I'm going to leave this question, I guess, intentionally open to talk about anything you would like to address just with your own experiences with that. I know I've heard conversations about just being careful about the types of open source journals that maybe you approach. And so maybe, yeah, just like a really open conversation about some of the advantages, disadvantages. And Sarita, you had also mentioned earlier, like non-academic publishing. So if you would like to include non-academic publishing versus academic publishing in this conversation as well, all of the information will be helpful. So maybe we'll open it up to Sarita first. If you're ready, if you need a bit of time, we could always start with someone else first.
Yeah, I have less to say about the first question. I'm more about the non-academic, so maybe we can begin with someone else.
All right, so maybe I'll just open it up. Sharla or Dale, would either of you like to jump in first?
I can jump in on that.
Thank you.
I think there's like, look, I think there's actually kind of two different sorts of questions embedded in this, right? Like one is about sort of predatory publications, and the other is really about like open source publication and closed source publication. So I'm going to focus on the like open source versus closed access question. And I think the predatory publication question will either end up coming back to, or it'll come up again, right? Look, I think that like open source publication is awesome. Like it's sort of, I think the gold standard is what we should all be striving for all the time. It's like we're almost always getting some degree of public funding for the work that we do. And I really hope, like, I think of, the sort of pursuit of knowledge as something that we do for the public good. And I think that like that should be published. Like this is like an ethical position that I'm going to like hold, right? And so open source publications, help with all of those things. But also closed access publications can sometimes be made open source. So you can like sometimes have a publication in a journal that is not open source. The journal is not open source, but your publication can be, accessible. And often this happens through partnerships between publishers and libraries. So, for example, I think Oxford has a deal with the University of Toronto libraries, and so like there's a publication that of mine that is able to be open source because of or open access rather, because of the relationship that the publisher has with the library. And so I think that like the sort of key thing at this stage, like, I mean, as a grad student, like you just need to get published. And, I wouldn't want to encourage folks early in their career to limit themselves to only publishing in open source journals because of the ethical considerations. I think that, the like status and prestige matter in a lot of ways, especially earlier in your career. And so, take the publications that you can get, and that really matters. But there often are ways to make publications accessible. And so it's worth, I think, at the stage of, getting that conditional accept, having a conversation with your library to figure out if that publication can be made open source or open access in another way. Sometimes that means posting a preprint on like an archive to make it accessible. And there are some options there. I think though that like one of the key or like one important consideration though is that open source journals tend to be cited more. That they tend to get more citations, they get picked up more because they're more accessible to like journalists and folks like that. So I think there's a kind of a like you have to weigh the sort of career stage and what you're hoping for the publication in terms of the like the journal status and what you need that publication to accomplish for you, but also the value and the merit of making your work accessible.
That was so helpful. Thank you. And Dale, I'll turn it over to you.
Actually, I thought that was a great response. I would say I just have a few things. I think some of the times, like I've had this conversation with students around whether or not they should go where the impact factor is versus how high it is, and make some of these sort of strict calculations when it comes to where they're submitting. I think I give my students similar advice to what Charla's already offered, which is this idea of like, if it means stultifying, getting your feet in the pool, rather than submitting to an open source journal, I think that that's something that you should definitely not allow you to, direct you one way or another. I also believe that like you want to go where, and I go back to my original language, which I got, very early on in my career, is this idea of where the conversation's being had. So, if a bunch of people are talking about, let's just say, stoic masculinities in a particular journal, take your work there because that's where the conversation is happening. I just think that the other side of this, and I've seen this happen fairly recently in the last 5 years, is students will come to me and say something like, I'm going to submit to this journal of which I've never heard before, and they're asking me for $2,500 up front. And I'm like, oh, well, no, you're not going to shell out $2,500 to get your paper submitted. And then they send me the link, and then I have to indicate to them, this has happened to me twice, indicate that, this journal is predatory, it's trying to siphon money off. And if the peer review process is too easy, it's probably like if they don't ask you for the money until after, and the peer review process is way too sort of light, I would suggest at some level that that's a predatory journal that's trying to, extract money from you in some way, shape, or form. So these are things to be really wary of. But, I have in some medical journals, they ask you to pay a nominal fee for copy editing and various other sorts of parts of that process. And that's not predatory, but it certainly isn't at this level of expense. So I think that, being aware of sort of these types of journals and, trying to maintain a certain level of like awareness of that, if the journal is reaching out to you and they're asking for money up front, then I would suggest that that's a predatory journal that you shouldn't publish in.
That's so wonderful. And actually, we might come back to like predatory journals and costs a little bit later in the conversation. But I think this would be a good opportunity just in thinking about some of the considerations in terms of like there is this publish or perish mentality, and publication, especially in early careers, is so important. And so, Sarita, going back to the academic versus non-academic, I know that's been something I've been thinking about as well, as like, well, I don't have time to publish in non-academic sources right now because I need these publications. So maybe if you did want to start that conversation as well, and thinking about some of those considerations.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to first respond to some of what the other panelists have said, because I think there are some fairly easy strategies to avoid some of these pitfalls that some of Dale students have ended up in, which is taking the time to be familiar with what's the top research in your field. Like, Dale just said, where's the conversation happening? So figuring out who are the key who are the top scholars, what are the top papers most cited, where are they published, which journals, what are the top journals in your field, what are the top tier journals, etc. What are the academic publishers, that's a wide range of things. It doesn't have to be the things that are impossible to get published in. There's a whole range of really reputable journals. I've never paid to have anything published, and certainly some of the academic presses that are associated with public universities do sometimes have to ask for support, but it's not the same thing as upfront fees. I think the only thing I've paid for is it's very common for academic presses to ask for you to pay for the index for your book to get indexed, for example. That's common, and that's about, I can't remember, $1,000, $1,500, couple $1,000 it can cost to get a book. But I, haven't paid for copy and haven't paid any other fees, nor for a journal. So I think there's certainly lots of possibilities for getting published without having to pay. And the second thing I'll say is that, having sat on many, chaired many hiring committees and many tenure committees, many promotion committees, is people do differentiate, between it's people who are familiar, who have taken the time to make themselves familiar with what are the key journals in the field and the publishers and so on, can recognize when a person has put their energies into what sometimes is called vanity publishing, right? Where you don't go through a formal peer review process, but you pay to get published. I mean, we all know, especially, it's not the same as it was when I started, 25 years ago, but it's much easier to get anything published. Publish your own book. There's lots of ways to get published if you need to get published. So if you're in that situation where you really had a hard time publishing something because you're really on the margins of a field, or it's impossible, or you have a project that it's not possible to find a publisher or a journal, I wouldn't discourage people from being creative about how to get published. So that's it's not like never do it. If the choice is between not publishing at all and finding some unusual place where you might have to pay, certainly I haven't but I'll just say nor my students have had to do that, because I think there's always a way to improve your paper, to find a community that can help you to get published in the ways that will help your career if your choice is an academic career. I think I want to return to your comment about I don't have time to do non-academic publishing, because I think this is a bigger question that we could have another whole other panel on, which is the difficulty of writing. Because I think for many of us, writing is an agonizing, difficult process that probably sometimes takes way too long, much longer than it should, because of these kinds of self-censorship. This isn't good enough. This is just going to take too long. This has to be like, I don't know how to do this. And actually publishing for a non-academic in a non-academic venue or audience takes a lot less time than something academic. And it doesn't even have to be on the same topic as what your primary empirical or whatever in-depth research is. It can be, for example, the conversation as a venue where people who are academics and have an expertise in an area often help to interpret current events or current issues. Let's say it's someone who's working in public health, talking about what's happening in the pandemic and explaining what's going on with vaccines and so on. Or it could be, and I encourage my faculty often to publish in this way. So I ask them, well, you're an art historian. What is happening today that you might have something to comment on? And it could be people pulling down statues. It could be reproductive rights. There's one of the most well-known articles in the conversation is an art historian commenting on the fly that landed on Mike Pence's head during the presidential debates and the history of flies in painting over the centuries. And it's so there's lots of ways for academics, scholars to comment and bring their expertise to current events and what's happening in the current moment. And that can be through media interviews, through podcasts, or through writing a 1,000-word rather piece, which, the first time you do it, it's a very different style of writing, might take you a week or two. And the second time you do it, you can probably sit down and do it in, a few days. So it's, compared to the years that it takes to publish something, to get an article, the research done, and so on, and published, and the reviews. And it can take like 2 or 3 years to get through a process sometimes. So I would say think of it as something parallel rather than instead of. And also, of course, it depends on what your goal is as a researcher, as a scholar. But is it to make a difference and to intervene in public conversations? Is it to make a difference in terms of social life or public life? I think for many sociologists, that is the case. It's like you started out from seeing a social problem and wanting to think about it, do something about it, intervene in it, research it, know more about it. And, even with academic journals that are more open access, most people aren't reading those or accessing those or understanding those or even motivated to. So if we really want to reach people, there's many other places where that needs to happen. So for example, I've given book talks at public libraries, for example, several times. I've had invitations from public libraries. I think, I got those invitations, but I'm sure they're always looking for people. So if it's the kind of thing that interests you, you could find out who organizes the public talks in your local library and say, I'm really interested in talking to people about this. And it's sometimes a matter of thinking about your research and framing it in a different way, making it more accessible, thinking about how does this relate to current debates? Why would people be interested in this? What different language can I use that's more accessible and less theoretical? I think that's really good practice, because if you're a graduate student interested in an academic career, you're also going to be teaching. And so you also have to be thinking about translating a research, not necessarily more accessible language, but in terms of how does it fit into the broader debates in an introductory sociology course, for example, or some kind of broader themed course compared to the narrow area that you're working in your research, which all of us do. So I think there's a lot of ways to think about what public scholarship means. It doesn't just have to mean publishing or writing. It could be some of my students sometimes have a blog where they post, there's a well-known academic who writes on whose field is computer science. And he's written several books, Cal Newport, that are about how to deep work, slow productivity, how to avoid email and social media and do more creative work, like how to study better, like all kinds of things that are completely, really very unrelated, quite unrelated to his scholarly work. And he started out doing that as a student and writing a blog aimed at other students. So I think there's a lot of ways to think about what are the ways in which we could be doing, other kinds of writing that actually, bring us pleasure, can connect with others, and are, and actually in some ways, easier, quicker, more fun, but also have actually greater impact in some cases. Like my non-academic pieces, I might get 30,000 people reading them in like a week, whereas the academic pieces, it takes quite a while to get that kind of an audience for the work. So I think there's many benefits that come back to the impact of our work ultimately as well.
This is all so helpful. Thank you all so much. And now that we're sort of thinking about different sources, one of our students had asked at the last webinar, and we didn't get a chance to ask the question, but is it audacious to submit to a top tier journal being a student?
No.
Not? Okay, so if not, are there certain considerations to be made when submitting to a top tier journal? I didn't know, Sarita, if you wanted to kind of continue with that or
Well, I think Sharla gave the best advice on that. Make sure your article is ready. And I think, and I'll say I've not taken that advice. Like I don't intend to. I mean, I make sure my article is ready, but I haven't tended in the past to ask other people to read it. It's just the way. But I think certainly when I've had the opportunity of having writing groups, that's been amazing to be able to have early iterations if other people read and give you suggestions. That's one way, or just even another reader that you have or your supervisor. I think making sure that you have something that's, is in everything that Charlotte said is exactly correct, that in one sentence, what's the contribution of the thesis, what's the argument, that, all basically well written is also well conceptualized, right? That those two things go well, tightly together. So when you feel really confident, you've read other articles in that journal, the one to which you want to submit, read all the criteria and so on, what do they usually publish? What does it sound like usually, et cetera. And you feel confident. I would say that, it's really important it's when you're starting out is when you have the greatest capacity for boldness, I think, just as Dale pointed out in his story. It's when you feel like, yeah, I need to change this discipline. I can do, you sometimes reach higher than people think that you should be for your level. But that's exactly when people make some great contributions. So I think I've always encouraged my students, master's and PhD students, to be publishing when they're still students in journals, and in fact, to sometimes create assignments so that they can, for example, I'll create a book review assignment. And so that they learn what is the structure of how to write a book review for a journal. And some of my PhD students have had their work, published out of that. And it's great to have just a small, early publication as a book review as your first publication to get your feet wet. So, and that can be in a top tier journal, for example. So I would encourage people definitely, because, if it gets rejected, just submit it somewhere else.
Dale, did you want to add to that, given that
Sure.
and then Sharla, you can add as well after.
So I've read Deep Work twice, so that's interesting that Sarita mentioned that. Okay, so I love that book. What I would say, and this is somewhat derived from that book, as well as several other books I've actually read on writing, is to form something that looks like, and I've done this as long as I can remember, is to form something of a sort of peer review network of folks that do work in your area that you trust enough. And in some cases, these folks may be not squarely in your area, but you're going to them for very specific things like refinement of an argument. I think the other sort of part of this is also a formation of sort of writing accountability groups. I participate in one now, and I find and I've been doing this for 8 years now, I think. And just finding that that is a good way of sort of making sure that on a weekly basis, I'm churning out something and just slowly building up um, different writing projects and trying to finish them. Um, the, because writing at the end of the day is very much habitual. It's something that if you're going to take that edge off that anxiety, um, you have to sort of be doing it regularly, much like if you were riding a bike or running, you wouldn't expect to be good at it by virtue of not doing it regularly. So I would say that that's that. I would also, the last thing I would sort of add to this conversation, which is sort of goes back to Sharla gave us the structure to go through here, and I was given this great advice by Andrew Doucette really early on when I was, and she's published in Gender and Society and some of these bigger journals, is to sort of take a paper and say, here's 8,000 words. Now I'm going to crunch it to 6. And that process by which you're starting to work the paper like a piece of metal that, relies on the principle of parsimony, which is like, can you say, what you're saying in much less words in a more accessible way that's less irritant, as Sharla would put it, and making sure that you're citing the right people. And that process of winnowing it down, I've found historically is what sort of inevitably results in a better paper. I also find that like you have to recognize that sometimes a journal will come back to you and say, yes, you submitted a paper that was 7,000 words to us, and that was our limit. Now you need to do those revisions that you in your head think that's going to take 1,000 words and still keep it at 7,000. So that exercise of sort of making sure that your paper is as good as it possibly can be to go to that big journal is a sort of process, right? This is not something that's um, it's a matter of refinement in terms of methodology of arriving at that paper that could get accepted to the high impact journals.
Thank you so much. And Sharla, I'll let you have the opportunity to add to that as well.
Thanks. I just want to make sure I'm addressing the question, right? Which was actually, is it audacious for a grad student to submit to a top tier journal? And like, I mean, I think like emphatically no, or maybe even better, yes, but be audacious. Like, I'm not sure which of those answers I like better, but you get the idea. I think though that like it's really important to consider the universe of pros and cons, the gives and takes, right? What are the risks and payoffs in this process? So this conversation that we're having about how to prepare the sort of like, being engaged in a community of scholars and having friendly readers who are going to give you feedback, all this stuff is awesome, and that's the path to publishing in a top tier journal. But they all take time. They all take a lot of time, right? And so as a student, I think you have to weigh so many considerations. Like, what are your ambitions? Do you want a job at a top, research university? If so, then you need to get published in a top journal. And so you probably want to put the time into that. If your ambitions are different from that, if you're focused more on teaching, if you're not trying to, land that job at whatever Stanford or something, then you don't necessarily need that top tier publication, and you can think differently about how to organize your time. But consider that I think there are basically 3 things that get papers published in top journals. I mean, like ASR, HAS, right? Like top journals, and that's novel theory, methodological innovation, and really impressive methods. Rarely do we see papers that have all 3 of them, but to get published in one of those journals, like ideally you'd have all 3. Probably you have 2. If it's just so amazing, maybe you have only one of those, but realistically, probably at least 2 of those. And that's not going to be every paper. But the payoff for this is actually really big, because one of the nice things about with these top journals is that they have an easier time finding reviewers. And so the reviews you get on papers that go to these top journals tend to be really high quality. And so it's kind of ironic that you send this paper to a really top tier journal, you get rejected, but you get these fantastic reviews, which actually help you make it prepare it so that it could get published in one of these really top tier journals. But of course, that takes time, right? So like we're talking about, I don't know, whatever, however many years you spent working on the paper, you submit it, and it takes whatever 3 to 6 months to get those reviews back, and then you have to go through the process of actually working on the paper and all this stuff. It all takes time. So the real question then is not I think it helps to submit a paper that is ready, for one, and then to be a little bit strategic and balance your time and your ambitions, which is like kind of bad advice and that is not really straightforward, but hopefully helpful in terms of weighing the universe of options.
That's really, really helpful. And funny, like you mentioned, Dale, I think about it being a game. And so just thinking about publishing as a game also sometimes and kind of what can be more beneficial, I think. And again, rather than taking things so personally, but thinking of it as that sort of game might help as well with navigating some of these concerns. So yeah, my brain, sorry, wheels are spinning right now as I'm listening to you all speak. So thank you. I do want to make sure we address like book publishing as well, because a lot of students, do sort of wonder, like, I'm doing years worth of work to write a thesis, write a dissertation, and I want to eventually get a book deal. Like, how do I turn my research into a book? Or some students might want to alternatively publish a book chapter rather than a journal with a section of their thesis. So maybe we can kind of turn towards that. And again, I'll kind of leave the question somewhat open, keeping in mind that like a lot of students just don't have any experience whatsoever with this. So if you just have any advice about how do I turn my research into a book chapter? How do I turn my research into a book, or how do I get a book deal? If any of you have any experience with book chapters, book deals, all of that, this would be a wonderful time to maybe address some of those issues. And maybe Sarita, I will open that question to you first, if you don't mind.
Sure. I think one of your questions was, should I be thinking about if writing my dissertation as a book, if I'm thinking about turning it into a book, like should I be thinking about that as I'm writing it? I mean, I don't have a really clear answer about that because they're very different projects in a sense, like the work that you have to do to convince a committee of the value of your research and its contributions and so on. It's unless things have changed a lot recently since like very recently, my last student defended last year. It's the expectations of a certain kind of methodological, theoretical underpinnings that are not at all required in a book, even for an academic press. And so I would say you just have to, it's just the work that has to be done. You have to write a really good dissertation, and that work, if you're then thinking of turning them into articles, will be helpful. And I don't think all of that's mutually exclusive, that there could be ways to turn some part of a dissertation into a book by adding, writing new introduction, writing new conclusions, writing new chapters, and so on. And then there might be one chapter that's like not going to fit in that book that turns into a journal article or a chapter elsewhere. Like there's a variety. There's no cookie cutter answer to this. Some people just take their dissertation and turn it straight into a book by rewriting it into different language and cutting out the methodology sections and so on. But I'll say that this is one place where this network, your reading group and your network will be helpful. Your committee will be able to advise. Your supervisor should be advising you. This is 3 perfect articles, or this is definitely book level. And if you're interested in turning your work into a book, or you have a book idea, the first step for, every publisher that I know is to write a book proposal. And there's usually standard guidelines in the publisher website that they are going to ask you particular things. For example, academic publishing has become much more constrained than it was 10, 20 years ago. They're publishing far fewer books, even the really big publishers. And so they really need to hear about your market analysis. What are the other books that are in this field? How's this book going to be different? Who's going to read this book? they're really increasingly interested in books that cross over between academic and, somewhat into specialist non-academic markets. And so that's even the academic presses. I see this increasingly, and I'm not just talking about my book, but other major publishers. I'm quite surprised by some of the major academic presses, the kinds of framing of academic books that are coming out even by major scholars. So thinking about, I would say again, the same thing as I said for journals, is go out and look and see who's publishing the work that you're interested in. Which publisher is it? And then buy those books, or go get those books in the library and just get a sense of how are they framing those? How are those books framed? What are the topics? What's the style, the writing style, and so on? What kinds of things? The relationship between theory and contemporary events, and so on. What thing and history? What's happening out there in publishing today? And how can I frame my book to look like it's aligned with that, but also offering something new that's not there and filling a gap? The same thing we always do for every grant, every journal article, everything we do is, what gap am I filling in the publishing market for the book? So I think that's, writing a good, strong proposal is the first step, because sometimes you won't have the book written. Because if they say, yes, we love your idea, you're still going to have to revise your entire dissertation or write your whole book. And so, my experience, the book that I just published, I sent the book proposal to several publishers, and several are very polite. We love your idea, but it doesn't fit. We don't have space, etc. And then the one that was interested, NYU Press, I feel like they phoned me or texted me within like an hour or two of me sending it. So you'll find the publisher that just says like, yes, this is for us. But you have to persevere, because it might not be the one that you think of first, or the one that you'd love to, or the one you think where it would fit best. But requires an editor, a series editor, who sees that this is just perfect for our trajectory for next spring or next fall. So that's, I don't know, I feel like I have more things to say, but if there's questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, and we will open the Q&A part of the conversation up in a couple of minutes. We had sort of aimed for about 3:30. But first, Dale, I did want to give you the opportunity to add to that if you would like. Sharla, I see that you're, I think, commenting or responding to a question in the Q&A.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a kind of one of those kind of awkward moments. I've published 7 books, 3 edited volumes over my career so far. I would say that my experience, I would say that there's a huge division between publishing with university presses, and which I've done maybe 5 or 6 times, 5 times. I would say then your sort of standard Routledge, Springer, and all those sort of publishing companies, which treat, I would say that the level of rigor, and I'm leading somewhere with all of this, the level of rigor that you get from a university press is different than what you're going to receive from Routledge. You might, in some cases, and I've reviewed for them, where they're just reviewing the prospectus. And then once the prospectus is approved by a series of reviewers about the direction of the book, you don't really get a full review. Whereas with university presses, you're going to have 3 long reviews of which you need to respond. And all of those things add up to time. And so you have to be cognizant of time when you're trying to publish a book and you're on the job market, and these things become, part of the thing that's woven into considerations of whether or not you're going to go that route. If you would have asked me when I was going through my PhD and when I finished, I think I was sort of somewhat, I guess I was the opposite of gun shy. I was quite aggressive in terms of wanting to get I did my PhD on mixed martial arts, or cage fighting, or what is commonly UFC. And so I wanted to get it out there because there hadn't been a lot written about it. And I think, looking back now, my only regret was sort of maybe waiting it out and taking it to a university press, because I had a better experience and a more rigorous analysis of my book when I've gone through several other books with university presses. So I should say that one is faster, but one is more rigorous in terms of its review of your book. That has its benefits, but I would suggest at some level that, and this goes, I think Sharla made a really interesting point, which is, where are you trying to work? What are you trying to do with this? And that matters immensely for if you are going to go to a Chicago University Press or University of Chicago Press. In my field, in criminology specifically, it's the highest ranked highest ranked press in, you know, so there's these sort of upper tier presses that you need to be aware of, and that if you want to go there, that means a lot of time and energy, a lot of courting that goes along with that. So there's all of these considerations that need to be made when you're doing it. In terms of the distillation process of taking your book and making it into, and taking your dissertation and making it into a book, I would say that it's a radical sort of shaving away of certain parts of the sort of methods that may get jettisoned to an appendix, and maybe get crunched down to a part of your introduction. These longer, and I've had this where the reviewer suggested that I take a longer theoretical chapter and make it dispersed amongst a bunch of other chapters. These are things that a reviewer can ask for, and you'll have to make a decision at that time whether or not this makes sense. You won't be able to have this, meta theoretical chapter the way that you will if you were going to be, writing a dissertation. So these are very different sort of expectations. And then I think the last thing, which Sarita touched on, is this like market is their primary consideration, whether it's a university press or it's a sort of academic press that's not affiliated with the university, is that they want to know, is this book going to sell? Where is it going to sell? What are the primary audiences? What are similar books? Do your research. In some cases, I've taken books that were published and said, here's how many sales, you can find out this information of this particular book. And I believe that my comparable book may end up selling at the same rate. These are all things that are part of that process and reflection on whether or not you want to go that route. Journal articles can take long as well. So you're not necessarily getting away from that time, which is the great, the great sort of consideration. But I think inevitably it'll be shorter than the development of a book. I would say the last thing is just to keep in mind is that some presses will limit the amount of what I would call double dipping. Some of them will say, you've already published this chapter as an article in this journal, so we don't want the reproduction of this. They want all original work, some of these presses, and you have to be aware of that when you're submitting the book, because they may say, we don't want anything that's been reproduced. Others will say it doesn't matter. So these are things that go into where you're going to take, and so you need to do that kind of research before you even start sending out the prospectus. I agree with Sarita. There's tons of guides out there. There's also house sort of house specific or publishing house specific sort of guides and they'll ask you very specific questions. This goes back to Charlotte's point. Pay attention. They're telling you something for something very specific. They're doing that because you don't want to waste their time. They've got to look through hundreds, if not thousands, of proposals. You want to give them exactly what they're asking for in their prospectus when you submit it. Don't make it generic, because they'll know it's generic.
That's so helpful as well. And I'm just going to remind the audience, if you do have questions, we'll be turning to those in just a minute. So please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A function. But before we do get to that, Sharla, would you like to add anything to the conversation?
Yeah, I just have a quick comment, because I think that my colleagues here have been fantastic in sort of thinking through, the various merits of book publishing versus article publication. I guess there's really like two quick things. The part of this question was about publishing book chapters, and like book chapters, I mean, again, I think it really depends a lot on what your particular goals are. If you're not looking for an academic job, then maybe publishing a book chapter is not really something you need to worry about doing. And you might just focus on publishing your publication, publishing your dissertation, because you really care deeply about it, and that's fantastic. I think it's a really maybe the best possible reason to focus on publishing as a book. But like book chapters tend not to get a whole lot of credit in terms of thinking about the job market and tenure and whatnot. So like I would say to just be sort of careful. I think they're actually fantastic as early publications. Like I have, I'll work on book chapters often with students, with grad students who, are like kind of earlier in their career, and I just want them to have something on their CV. And so I think they're often like great as opportunities to put something out in the world. And depending on what your goals are, they may not serve them very well. The other thing consideration is that books can be like, again, depending on what your goals are, they might be a bit risky. Like if you're gonna have a job in a place where you really need to have like a publication or two a year, it takes years to get a book published, and so you might also think about how you can also write that chapter or take that piece that's going to be a journal article or whatnot as well. So you may not have depending on what your life is, you may not have the luxury of just focusing on publishing that book and that being the one thing you focus on.
Yeah, this has all been so wonderful. I'm taking notes myself as you're all speaking. So I really appreciate all of the thought that you've been putting into the answers. Before we open it up to the Q&A, does anyone just want to add anything about any of the stuff that we've discussed already? Yes, Rita.
Yeah, I just wanted to add about book chapters. The thing about how I see book chapters is people are putting together an interesting collection of colleagues on a particular question. And so I never say, oh, I'm going to write a book chapter. It's always someone says, Sharla goes, hey, I'm putting together an anthology, a collection on this question, on how to teach about race or whatever. Or how do you teach? And then do you have anything to say? And I won't have written about it before or even thought much about it before. And so it's really an invitation to do some writing that I wouldn't have otherwise done. And so I usually say yes, even though it's a ton of work to start a whole new project and thinking about a whole new thing. And sometimes I'm halfway through it and think, why did I agree to this? This is like so much work. One of my pieces is in a book called Sociology in the First Person, which is a reflection on my career as a sociologist and how it relates to my life. Like I had never written anything like that, nothing autobiographical before. It was agonizing to write. What's the thesis here? What's the theme? It was really challenging. But I'm so glad I wrote it because it made me reflect on something that I otherwise would not have reflected on. And so that's how I think of the contribution of book chapters. It makes me do that work. It's a writing exercise for me, but it's also me participating in my disciplinary community because it connects me to those people who are the editors of that anthology. It connects me to a whole, new group of people. And it's really like it's like service to this discipline almost, and yet it's also a publication. So people see you as being it's evidence of how you're being active in your discipline and the kind of thinker you are and a kind of range that you have as well, because sometimes our own research is relatively narrow and it stretches us. And I think of it as a way to stretch yourself in other directions. So maybe ask yourself that when a book chapter comes up: is this an opportunity for me to think in a new way and to connect to new people? And that's how I usually see it. And it is definitely like less rigorous. That's why it's not taken seen in the same way as other publishing. But that's part of what makes it fun to do. So fun. Our idea of fun. Thanks.
That's so wonderful. So yeah, I'm going to jump into some of the questions that have been posted. And I'm actually going to start with the last one because it's got a couple of upvotes there as well. But they're asking, in the past, I had to wait a year before receiving rejection from a journal. It drains out so much time. What's your best advice to utilize the time well? And we've been talking a lot about time, I think, today. So I think this is a really great question. And maybe, Sharla, did you want to address that one first? Unless you need some time to think about that. So just to repeat the question, in waiting a year to receive a rejection from a journal, it drains out time. So what's your best advice to utilize the time well?
Yeah, gosh, I hate this. I've absolutely been there, man. I waited 10 months for rejection from AJS on a paper that I had poured my soul into. It's out now. The paper is in social problems, but man, that 10 months I waited at AJS while I was, my tenure clock was ticking through. It was really, really stressful. Um, I think that the thing that kept me sane was working on other stuff. And so probably the best advice I can offer on this is um, to have more than one thing you're working on at a time. I had someone, this was Tanya Goleshpoza, who was like so prolific, and her rule is to always have something under review. I guess that kind of takes the pressure off that was under review for so long, but like, the idea would be that by the time that comes back, and you don't know how long it's going to be, ideally it would be like 3 months, you would have something else that's ready to go out. And there's someone else, I can't remember who, suggested having like 6 papers in progress at any given moment that you're kind of like picking up and rotating through. So the idea here is that one paper is not the only thing you're working on, and realistically, it just doesn't get to be the only thing you're working on.
That's some great solid advice. Dale, did you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, Sharla hit the nail on the head. I would say that that's the best advice. I also think that at some level, after 6 months, I think it's within reason, and I've been on both sides of this coin, to reach out to the editor and say, hey, my paper's been under revision or under review for the last 6 months. Just wondering if there's been an update. You're not saying I want my review. You need to be polite. You need to be understanding the fact that there's a lot of goes into review, especially double blind review. And so, that kind of uh, inquiry is not out of the question when it comes to trying to find out what's going on. There's also one of the reasons that you really want to go to conferences, at least, and talk to other people that are in your field, is you can hear about journals. Like in my fields that I contribute to, there's certain journals that's like, if you submit there, you're going to wait 8 months or a year. And so you just put it in and forget about it. And then sort of consider that that's generally people's experiences. But I would not recommend pulling, like your first reaction should never be to pull the paper just because it's taking long, because sometimes you'll have the same experience at another journal and the clock is going to keep ticking. I just think that, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing just to check it.
That's great, helpful advice as well. And I think a lot of students are nervous about crossing boundaries like that sometimes. So I guess that's reassuring to hear as well. And Sarita, did you want to offer some advice as well about best utilizing time?
I mean, that's exactly right, that advice. I just do think a year is an incredibly long time. I'm a little bit shocked to hear that. I've never waited that long, and I do a lot of reviews, and they're always quite timely. Like the timelines are, so I'm quite surprised. I mean, even for a manuscript review, it does take a few months, but because they have to find people and send it out, and the person has to read the book, and the comments have to come back to you. But yeah, that's a long time. I don't know what to say. I think it's, journals are working under all kinds of pressures, and so are academics who are being asked to do the reviews. So this is the nature of the work, of the context of the occupation. It's unfortunate, but it's true. That's the only advice possible, is you have to have a lot of different things going, and just factor that into your timeline of, I may get a rejection at the end of this time, and I'm going to have to be, starting it again. I think, everyone is aware of this constraint. If you're, so I would say, this is one thing I would say, is that make sure that if you're submitting your CV somewhere or you're explaining who you are and what you're doing, that it's clear that you have submitted something, that something is under review, that you've received, that you received a review and revise and resubmit. Just like this is all part of showing that you're active, so it actually still counts that you wrote an article and submitted and that it's under review. So I think don't think of it as a failure or like something that doesn't count. It still counts. I think that's an important piece to remember as well.
Thank you so much. And you just mentioned like revise and resubmit. And I just want to let the audience know that in part one, we did talk a lot about terminology that's related to publishing, because sometimes that terminology is also confusing. So if you do have more questions, if you're brand new to this and want to learn more about like revise and resubmit and what that means and some of the basics of writing a paper and structuring a paper, don't forget to check out the part one recording, which I know Sherry has put in the chat for us. All that said, we're going to jump to another question as well. Someone's just said that they received a mountain of feedback and it was all incredible, but they simply did not have the time to review it due to unexpected added duties in their life. So they agree with all the critiques. It's just a huge amount of feedback from all three reviewers. So do you have any tips on properly incorporating a massive wealth of critique and feedback within a small amount of capacity? And we have talked a little bit about how important it can be to get some really great critical feedback. But yeah, just again, thinking about time. And if we are working on other publications as well, to keep that flow steady, how do we then kind of balance all of that? So if you have advice, just dealing with a lot of critique and finding the time to deal with that. I don't want to pick on anyone. Dale, it looks like you're thinking, so I don't know if I want to jump to you first, or do you need a bit of time?
I can share something, which is I received the first round of reviews for my book when I was in the first year of being a dean during a pandemic and so on. So two single parenting, two kids, like it was, not a lot of time just to say that I understand. And not a lot of it wasn't even a lot of changes that were requested. I mean, in the end, I wrote an additional chapter to the book in response to so it did take me time. I'll say it took me like probably a year, to address those small because of working full time and parenting. And so what I would say is keep steady at it. Just as Dale said earlier, just make sure that you are always bracketing time, whether it's an hour a week whether it's a Saturday morning, whatever that is, as long as you're just chipping away, it will get done. And it doesn't, most publishers don't care if it takes you a year. If they're interested in the piece and they have things, they will publish it in the year. So don't panic about it. Take it as an opportunity, and be grateful that you got this great advice and that you have an opportunity to get a paper. Think of it that way. The timeline of when the paper comes out, unless it's some kind of, I don't think in sociology, most of our research is necessarily like, we're racing against the clock for this other medical researchers. It's like, it's fine if it comes out in, a few months later than you've expected. You will find the time and just steadily chipping away and bracketing the time. Like maybe it's in 4 months, have your work plan laid out and know in April when classes are over, or when this job is finished or this contract's over, I'm going to bracket this month or whatever, just make sure you make time for it in a steady way. So you keep your hands on it, even if it's reading the reviews, making notes when you don't have time, and then knowing that in 3 months, you're going to have time to sit down and address them. It's a matter of making a work plan steadily and in a long-term kind of plan, in a long-term way, and rather than panicking.
Thank you for that. Dale or Sharla, did you want to add? Dale, go ahead.
Sure. Like one of the advice that I got, again, from when I was very, very early on in my PhD was that it's best to read lengthy reviews very closely when you receive them. And then if it's a bit of a sting one way or another, or it's long and sort of overwhelming, maybe go for a walk, step away from it for a few days, maybe put it in a folder, whatever you need to do. But give yourself some time to sort of think about sort of what's being said about the paper, especially if, if it's what Sharla was talking about, like this paper that she had poured her soul into with arguably one of the biggest journals in sociology, or the biggest. Um, I think that that kind of like being overwhelmed is not helped by virtue of staring at the page or the email for long periods of time. I know that that was for me what helped, when I experienced that first rejection. And since then, I always sort of like, when you get the reject sort of headline in your email, you sort of read through it and go, okay, this was happened for a reason, or I disagree with what's being said, which is going to be my second point, which is just because somebody's written a long uh, sort of critique of what you're doing doesn't necessarily mean that in whole or in part they want you to completely revise that. It's a negotiation, it's a conversation that you're having with the editor. And if you've demonstrated that you've taken them seriously in terms of what they're trying to convey to you, so for example, you make a revision, but you're not necessarily sort of completely in line with what they're saying, this is an important sort of exercise. And I think just because the review says this doesn't mean you have to do what they say. Because I think that's an important sort of thing to keep in mind. Conversely, being highly defensive will never get you a paper accepted. So it's very difficult to stick to your guns in this particular instance, unless you feel like it's sending the paper in a completely different direction. And I've had that, and I've pulled papers because of that, because I was like, no, this is not what I wanted this paper to go in that direction for. So, yeah.
That's great. Sharla, would you like to add as well?
Yeah, thanks. I want to just emphasize, I think everything my co-panelists just said, Srita and Dale, like you're absolutely right. I think that's, first of all, like having a work plan that you can work. Even if you don't like stick to it, just having that plan makes a huge difference in terms of approaching things. And that, yeah, sometimes reviews sting, and like what you need to do is you get them, you skim them over, you go, this is just whatever, and put it in a drawer and walk away for a while, until you can re-encounter it in with a little bit less emotion. I think that I want to say that I have like a specific like pragmatic strategic thing that I do, which is when I am ready to confront the reviews, which is usually not the moment I get them. But when I'm ready to confront them, which might be, a few days, that Dale, I love that it only takes you a few days to get over your feelings. It usually takes me a little bit more than that. So when I'm over my feel, when I can, when I'm ready to encounter it again, it's usually more like a few weeks, maybe a month, but not always. It depends on what the reviews are like. But I sit down and I take them and I read them really carefully and I turn them into a to-do list, usually with like direct quotes from all the reviewers, and it's just like just absolutely a list. Sometimes it ends up being several pages of things to do with like clear details about what the reviewers like actually specifically asked for. And I have two goals for this. One is that I don't want to have to look at the review specifically again. So this document is all I'm going to use now to kind of guide myself through the revisions. I'm also going to go back. I'm going to go into the document and make the revisions. Then I'm going to go back into my to-do list version of this and type up what I actually did. And that document is going to become my my response letter back to the editor. And actually, the response letter to the editor is a huge part of writing of a revise and resubmit. Like they want to see what you did, and that's the space where like you really need to demonstrate that the reviewers asked me to do this and I did it, or I did it in this way, or I didn't do it because. And that's the space where like you really have to get your defensiveness out of it. And I find that having it as this like kind of neutral to-do document really shifts my perspective and makes it a lot easier for me to respond like to the reviews in a way that is, from to respond to them as if they are given in a spirit of generosity. But I think part of this question was like, just the frustration of how much work this stuff takes. And I think that, the truth of it is in a lot of the things we do, there's no way through it but through it. And so, break it into the pieces that will allow you to not feel overwhelmed. For me, that's my like to-do list. Sometimes it's walking away. I love Dale's, kind of reference here that there's like sometimes you can't some problems you can solve with the keyboard and some problems you can't solve with the keyboard. I go for a lot of walks without headphones or anything just to kind of think through what I'm dealing with. If I can't solve the problem with the keyboard, like, well, maybe the keyboard's not the right place for me, but there are, figuring out where it is that you need to be able to be in your head and figure out how to solve that problem is part of it's like part of the joy, but also part of the work of doing this work.
That's so helpful. I know walking without headphones for me it's been so helpful. We are getting close to the end of the session, and so I do want to ask you all to maybe just in a minute or so, if there's like one piece of advice that you've learned through publishing or that you tend to offer students, yeah, just leave with one solid piece of advice. And maybe we'll start in alphabetical order, but to give you just a minute or two to think about it before we jump in, I do just want to address some of the questions that were in the chat. There was a question about qualitative compared to quantitative research, and we talked about that a lot in part one. So again, Sherry has put the link to part one in the chat. So you're welcome to go review the recording to get some more answers about that. And same with the last question about getting the paper rejected and some of the comments and approaches. That exact question almost was asked also in part one. So again, please feel free to review the recording for part one. And hopefully that's given you just a minute or so to think about a response for advice. And yeah, we'll go alphabetical order. So Sharla, by last name, sorry. So Sharla, we'll start with you, and then Dale, and then Sarita.
Sure. I think if I have to boil, oh man, there's so many things I could say, but the one that has felt most important to me is to engage my work as part of a community of scholars, right? To be in conversation with other people in my field, to think broadly about what my field means, to to sort of gain what I can from talking to other people. And that also I think means like having folks that I can ask to be a friendly reader for me. But all of this kind of comes down to like thinking about the work of sociological scholarship as part of it's something that's done in community.
And Dale, you to offer your advice. Thank you, Sharla.
Well, I think Charlotte sort of pointed to something that that taps into what I'm going to say is that we've sort of talked about a lot about the pains of all of this process, but like there is an agony and ecstasy to this whole thing. And when you get that paper accepted, I still to this day get like an adrenaline rush and like some sort of like I don't want to say neurochemical reaction, but some type of real sort of excitement that my work has been affirmed in some way, shape, or form, and that I'm like, I think that affirmation, however sort of it, impersonal as it seems, is also sort of part of the sort of fun of this whole thing is that you should enjoy parts of it and, sending it off. If you need to sort of associate that with, going out and having a coffee at Starbucks or whatever it is, or going for a run, to sort of say, okay, I got this thing done, this very important thing, I've sent it off to this journal, or I've gotten it accepted, is to sort of recognize it like that there should be some enjoyment to all of this. And I think that that's an important sort of part of all of this. This is not just pain. It's also, it will feel that much sweeter when, you have a paper, get it rejected, and then it eventually goes on to be accepted. I think that's an important thing.
That's really valuable advice as well. Just again, thinking about the balance between everything. And Sarita, your turn.
I don't think I have anything new to add in terms of advice. I would say the advice about a writing community is really important. When I was a graduate student, it was invaluable. It was hard to reproduce as an academic because people become so much busier traveling and teaching, and it's hard to sustain, but I have managed to do it. And then even just having a writing buddy, like meeting at a cafe or a library or something, I continue to do things like that. So I think just having some kind of writing community is really important. And the second thing is having a writing schedule. Like not only a writing schedule as in, oh, Friday after, even Fridays are going to be my writing day, or research day, but a lot for me when I had a lot of projects in the go, as a young, earlier academic, several articles, conferences, and so on. I had a work plan, and as I began to have PhD students, I made them all do a work plan as well. So if your work plan's on the side, get ethics approval, write chapter 1, whatever's on the side, all your projects, submit an abstract at this conference, and across the top the dates. Just have some kind of bigger work plan. So there's a question in the chat about, do you put time aside? How much time do you put a time limit on how long it takes to write an article? Well, your work plan will tell you that. For me, it was always, whether I was a grad student, during the year I was taking classes and teaching and TAing, and then as an academic I was teaching. So my time is, we all have a research term as academics, so that's, it's like that's our time limit for doing the intense work. And then during the teaching term, you're maybe revising, writing abstracts, doing not, less intense writing and less intense work. So that's how it's naturally organized. But for others, it may be different. And so whatever your timeline tells you, I have 3 months from April to April, May, June, or whatever to write this piece. That's going to be the time that you have, and you're going to. So I would say that the work plan for everyone, you make the big work plan and then figure out how it's going to be implemented in your calendar. It's a craft, writing and creating, but it's also a job that's needs a work plan.
Amazing. I want to thank you all so much for being here. And I know, again, we had the part 1 where we talked about a whole other set of things to do with publication. And so I'm sure we could talk for another hour about, behind the scenes stuff when it comes to publication. So I just can't thank you all enough so much for your time being here today. I've just added in the chat the email address for the student, CSA student website or email address there. Also, our next webinar on emotionally demanding research is coming up on Wednesday, March 4th at noon. So everyone, please keep your eyes open for that. And again, to all of our panelists, thank you so much. Thank you, Sherry, for all of your technological help today. And thank you so much to all of our attendees for this wonderful panel today.
Thank you so much for your great questions.
Thank you.
And thanks, everyone.